Before I was a politician, I was a middle school teacher. So I taught sixth grade language arts on the west side of San Antonio in San Antonio ISD. And, I taught students from all different backgrounds with all different beliefs. And so when this bill was brought forward to the Public Education Committee, I found it offensive as an educator that we would impose one religious tradition onto all of our students, including students that don't belong to that particular tradition. And then, as a Christian myself, I found the bill offensive to my faith, and tried to articulate that in the committee hearing that you referenced.
Well, and I think what kind of set that off and really was inspiring to so many people who saw it on social media was how authentically, you could speak to how this offended you as a Christian. And I think sometimes these proposals are put forward as a way to promote Christianity. And it's important for those of us who are Christians to speak out against it. I lead an organization called BJC, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. And we as Baptists have deep concerns about this legislation because of our religious freedom concerns. First, knowing we think the Ten Commandments is a really important religious document. It's important to us as Baptists. So we're not debating, whether the Ten Commandments are good or not. We're debating whose job it is to teach them and to promote them. And if Texas passes this law, then they are picking and choosing among religions and even among versions of the Ten Commandments, right? Like this particular translation that they've chosen to put in this bill.
Yeah, this bill does a disservice to both Judaism and Christianity. As you know, there are way more than 10 commandments in the Jewish tradition. There are 613 in the Hebrew Bible. And the irony for us Christians is that we follow a rabbi who tried to simplify those 613 commandments into two: love God and love neighbor. And this bill is not doing anything to love God or love neighbor. And in fact, it's discriminating against our neighbors, our Hindu neighbors, our Buddhist neighbors, our Sikh neighbors, our atheist neighbors. So this bill is doing violence to both faith traditions that it claims to represent.
Right. And it's also promoting bad history. You hear the proponents of this bill say over and over again that the Ten Commandments are the basis for our law and policy, when in fact, there's no evidence that the Ten Commandments played some special role in American law. And the U.S. Constitution doesn't mention Christianity or Christian. And the only time it mentions religion is to ban religious tests for public office. So we're not only having the government promote one religion over others or one religious text over others, but we also have the government promoting bad history in the name of serving education. So it seems like bad policy all the way around.
That's right. I think as a big fan of our founding fathers, and as a history buff myself, I think it's fair to say from a historical perspective that you and I, Amanda, are a lot more religious than some of our founding fathers. Not only do we have the Establishment Clause in our First Amendment to our U.S. Constitution, we also have the tradition of a separation between church and state. And in the committee hearing, one of our conservative colleagues pointed out that the separation of church and state, that phrase doesn't appear in the Bill of Rights, which is true, but it was written by a little-known historical figure named Thomas Jefferson. So I think you're absolutely right that not only should we combat this from a religious perspective, which is what I did in the hearing, we should also be very clear that this has no historical basis in American history.
Yeah. So I'm curious about kind of what inspired you to really devote yourself to this line of questioning at the hearing itself. I mean, you have so many different issues on your plate as a legislator, and you clearly, it felt that you were very passionate about speaking out against this bill at the hearing. And so just wanted to hear a little bit about what inspired your advocacy.
Well, I think I've seen over this entire legislative session this influence from Christian nationalists and Christo-fascists on our public policy. it's not just this bill about the Ten Commandments. It's also the bill that would replace school counselors with chaplains. As someone who's in seminary right now, I know that chaplains do amazing work in our prisons, in our hospitals, in our armed forces. And I'm not opposed to chaplains in some tightly regulated way being involved in our schools, but I can't in good conscience sit here and say they have the same qualifications or perform the same duties as a school counselor. There's also legislation that would hurt our LGBTQ community that's directly inspired by this Christian nationalist movement. And we've seen here in Texas in the past 2 years the most extreme abortion ban in the country going into effect because of this Christian nationalist movement. So this has not just been something this session. It's not just something this decade. It's really been the last 40 years of the religious right pushing our country in the wrong direction. And I, as an American, as a Christian, refuse to let them take over our democracy and take over our faith.
I'm glad that you named Christian nationalism, because we at BJC have been working in coalition with a number of others in a movement we call Christians Against Christian Nationalism, to draw attention to this poisonous ideology that tries to merge our identities as Americans and Christians in ways that threaten our democracy and our equality as Americans, regardless of religious tradition, as well as a faithful witness to Christianity. And I've seen so often how those who are promoting Christian nationalism falsely say that to oppose it is to oppose Christianity. And so I think there's a special responsibility from those of us who are Christians to answer that and to say, no, it is because of our Christian values, it is because of our patriotism that we are speaking out against Christian nationalism. And so I do view this particular measure of the posting of the Ten Commandments as an example of this Christian nationalist agenda as well. And I'm wondering, also, I know in addition to your very busy life as a state legislator, that you are also a current seminary student. And I'm just wondering how your education in seminary has informed your advocacy as well as your practice as a legislator.
Yeah. Well, first, I think your analysis of Christian nationalism is spot on. And, sometimes I use the term Christofascism. I think they're very similar terms. My favorite theologian, Dorothy Sola, coined that term Christofascism in the 70s. And it was used to describe the worship of power, social power, political power, economic power in the name of Christ. And as you said, I think it's our obligation as Christians to speak out against that perversion of our faith, because our Christian values are absolutely aligned with small d democratic values, right? I think a true multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-gender democracy is the closest thing that we have to the kingdom of heaven. And anything that's going to violate that vision, which Jesus articulated so well in the first century, is something that should be offensive to anyone who loves democracy or anyone who loves Christianity. I'm the grandson of a Baptist preacher from South Texas. My faith is why I'm in politics, because I was told that loving thy neighbor is the most important commandment, along with loving God. And my faith taught me that love has to grow into justice, right? Justice is just love out in public. And that's what led me to be a teacher, as I mentioned earlier. It's what led me to run a nonprofit, and what led me to run for office 5 years ago. And being here in the legislature as someone who cares about democracy, cares about human rights, cares about marginalized people, it can be really difficult. It's really hard to work in a place like this and not lose sight of what we're trying to accomplish, or lose hope that something positive can be accomplished. So going to seminary was kind of a way for me to combat that hopelessness. And I think it's helped me hold both of those two commandments, loving thy neighbor and loving God, together, because both are necessary to sustain ourselves in these struggles that we're a part of.
I think one thing that I'm finding particularly troubling when I look at what's happening, not just in the Texas legislature, but in other legislatures around the country, is using this kind of misunderstanding of separation of church and state and swinging so much in the other direction of saying that it is the job of the state, and particularly in the public school context, to promote some kind of religion, even if they are doing it in a very generic way. And we've seen that in a spate of bills, for instance, on requiring the posting of "In God We Trust" in public school classrooms. I know that's something the Texas legislature did last session, and a number of others have done as well. And we're seeing it again now with this next phase of trying to require the posting of the 10 Commandments. I'm just wondering, especially since you serve on the Public Education Committee, kind of how you see this Christian nationalist agenda impacting our public schools in particular, and just kind of what this means for our kids, 90% of whom continue to be educated in public schools.
Yeah, the thing I find interesting is that the same politicians who are pushing these Christian nationalist bills to indoctrinate our public school students into a particular faith tradition are the same politicians who loudly resist any effort to include LGBTQ students or talk about our country's history of racism under the banner of education, not indoctrination, right? That's the slogan you hear repeatedly from Governor Abbott and right-wing politicians throughout the country: education, not indoctrination. And I guess I'm just confused why having a rainbow in class is considered indoctrination, but not having the 10 Commandments. There feels like a disconnect between what they consider indoctrination and what's actually indoctrination. And that's something I think we have to be really clear about and expose for the hypocrisy that it is.
Yeah, and especially those of us who are Christians, I think, and when they're trying to promote a certain form of Christianity in the public schools, to understand that this doesn't help us either. This isn't just an attack on our neighbors who are from a different faith tradition or who don't claim a faith tradition, but it's troubling to us as Christian parents as well, because we don't trust the state to teach religion to our kids either. It's
not the state's role. Like I said, it's not only unconstitutional and un-American, but it's unchristian. I'm hopeful that Christians around the country, not just here in Texas, but in conservative states all across America, are going to have the courage to speak out against these attempts to pervert our faith and pervert our Constitution.
Yeah, I did hear in the Senate hearing the proponents of the bill encouraging the Senate that if the legislature passes the bill, then other states will follow. So this policy is really not just about what's happening in Texas now, but a trend that could go to other states. So thank you again for being on the front lines and trying to stop this bad policy and this bad legislation from coming law in Texas.
No, it's my honor to be in this fight with y'all, and I'm so happy that we got a chance to talk about it today.